November 4, 1979. Hundreds of Iranian students scale the walls of the American Embassy in Tehran. Inside, roughly 66 Americans are seized. 13 would be released within weeks, but 52 would remain trapped for the long haul. The Marines on duty stood down under restrictive rules of engagement, shaped by political orders to avoid a shootout that could spiral. Declassified cables now confirm they were explicitly instructed to limit the use of lethal force. Why had advance warnings been overlooked? Why was the embassy so exposed despite months of violent demonstrations nearby? With newly released testimony in 2025 and declassified files, this documentary follows those 444 days through the military failures, covert rescues, and diplomatic maneuvers that defined the crisis. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary Sunday morning in Tehran. The shock of November 1979. The embassy takeover in November 1979 struck Washington with the force of a political earthquake. In Tehran, a crowd of students massed at the high walls of the American compound, ropes and banners in hand. They climbed over the perimeter, forced gates, and quickly overwhelmed the security presence. Within minutes, the embassy grounds were no longer American territory in practice, but Iranian revolutionary space. Inside, the small contingent of US Marines did not follow the defense procedures they had drilled repeatedly. Their weapons remained secured, ammunition never distributed. The personnel had been reduced in size since the revolution, cut down from the large Cold War-era embassy staff to only dozens remaining on station. What might once have been defended by layers of diplomatic and intelligence resources was now left with only a skeleton team. Even as hundreds of demonstrators pushed into the compound, there was no armed resistance. For years, historians debated why no defense was mounted at all. Some assumed the Marines had underestimated the students. Others suspected hesitation over escalation. Declassified logs and diplomatic cables now show a more concrete picture. The embassy had asked for clarification on its rules of engagement. Washington's response emphasized restraint, pressing that no lethal force should be used against demonstrators under any circumstances. The rationale was clear. Gunfire could provoke outright bloodshed, turning a student demonstration into an international massacre. Yet the effect was paralysis. On the ground, orders and caution merged until resistance seemed impossible. The results were captured in media images that circled the globe. On live broadcasts, Americans saw blindfolded diplomats marched at gunpoint, hands bound or covered in heavy cloth sacks. Work offices were ripped apart, classified files seized, and documents scattered on embassy floors. US officials, meanwhile, struggled even to agree on the language of response. Was this just a protest, or had it crossed into an act of war? Photographs in nearly every newspaper and video replayed on evening broadcasts defined the answer in public opinion long before any internal decision was made. For many watching, the United States looked passive and defenseless. Beyond the television screens, Tehran itself was fractured. The revolutionary government was only beginning to solidify its structure, and its coalition contained fault lines. Clerical loyalists to Ayatollah Khomeini mingled uneasily with Marxist and secular revolutionaries who had toppled the Shah months earlier. Each faction saw in the embassy seizure not just a symbolic blow against American influence, but a chance to claim revolutionary legitimacy. Whoever could position themselves as the true enemy of the United States would earn both prestige and control of the narrative at home. The students had delivered a prize every group wanted to claim. American military and diplomatic records make clear that warnings of the embassy's vulnerability existed. Demonstrations outside the compound had grown bolder in the weeks before the breach, and embassy staff had filed reports about the increased danger. Iranian authorities had pledged protection, but sent little more than token police support. Higher-level officials, however, judged the risk manageable, dismissing the students as angry but transient. The Shah's exile was thought to have pulled the strongest fuel from the movement. In Washington, few believed a large-scale breach would be attempted, let alone succeed. That miscalculation quickly became obvious. Once the gates broke, American lives became bargaining chips. Hostages were separated, interrogated, and locked in improvised holding rooms. In propaganda flyers and local broadcasts, they were shown as defeated symbols of imperial arrogance. For the students, parading them through the compound and out onto the streets proved that revolutionary fervor could humble a superpower. Inside Iran, the capture simultaneously humiliated Washington and forced rival factions to take sides on who controlled the meaning of this victory. Television amplified that humiliation. Night after night, the same images played across continents. Chants, flags, and celebratory banners contrasted with the silence from cautious US press conferences. The domestic impact inside the United States was immediate. Viewers demanded a decisive response, but officials faced a dangerous dilemma. A military rescue or retaliation risked plunging the country into open war with a government still unsteady in its own revolution. Waiting looked like weakness, yet intervention carried the chance of disaster. Inside Iran, the fissures widened. University groups proclaimed that they had struck at the heart of imperial interference. Leftist elements worried that Islamists would monopolize the political credit, sidelining their own role in the revolution. Some secular leaders objected that seizing an embassy endangered recognition for a state not yet fully formed. But none of these voices carried the same weight once Ayatollah Khomeini himself gave signals of support. The debate over legitimacy shifted as soon as the students could present themselves as acting under a larger spiritual and political mandate. At the same time, decisions over the hostages' fates highlighted the political complexity. Within weeks, 13 captives, women and African American staff, were released, presented as a rhetorical gesture that Iran was not at war with oppressed groups, but with US policy itself. This move showed a calculating side to the crisis. It wasn't indiscriminate rage. It was an attempt to frame the event as principled resistance. The hostages who remained became stage props for both revolutionary competition inside Iran and rising anger inside the United States. The shock in Washington deepened when Khomeini praised the student action outright, calling it a second revolution. That phrase anchored the event as more than protest. It elevated the embassy seizure into a defining moment of the new republic, recasting young occupiers and their blindfolded captives into symbols of legitimacy for the Islamic State. In the eyes of its leadership, Iran had framed itself not as vulnerable after overthrowing a monarch, but as assertive enough to defy the United States openly. The fusion of youthful activism, clerical approval, and international spectacle made the crisis far more formidable than an isolated act of violence. For the hostages themselves, the reality was harsh detention, long interrogations, and uncertain survival. For policymakers in Washington and factions in Tehran, their imprisonment was ammunition in a broader contest over the shape of Iran's future. Every blindfolded march through the cameras or staged statement from the compound spoke to audiences far beyond the walls of the embassy. What began as the forcible entry of students into a lightly defended compound evolved almost instantly into a power struggle that stretched beyond Tehran's streets. Exposed vulnerabilities in American decision-making, internal fractures inside Iran, and global broadcasts magnified the shock of November 1979 into an enduring crisis. With Khomeini's endorsement, the hostage seizure was no longer a rogue protest, but political theater with state backing. This raised the deeper question that haunted leaders on both sides, not simply how the takeover had happened, but why Iran's highest authority had chosen to embrace it rather than shut it down. Khomeini's calculated embrace. Ayatollah Khomeini's rapid public endorsement of the embassy seizure was not simply rhetoric against America. It was a calculated maneuver to anchor his own dominance at a volatile moment. By calling the takeover a second revolution, he transformed an unauthorized student operation into a sanctioned act of national defiance. This framing allowed him to present the crisis as religiously ordained, directed by his leadership, and inseparable from the survival of the revolution itself. In doing so, Khomeini found both a way to consolidate authority and a means to diminish rival factions that had also laid claim to Iran's revolutionary identity. The timing of his embrace mattered. In late 1979, Iran's political order was still unsettled. Clerics loyal to Khomeini shared the stage uneasily with Marxist movements, secular liberals, and former allies of the revolutionary coalition. Each faction claimed to represent the true direction of post-Shah Iran. Anti-Americanism had become the currency of revolutionary legitimacy, and Khomeini recognized that whichever group controlled that narrative would gain decisive momentum. The left had long styled itself the vanguard of anti-imperialist struggle, portraying American ties to the Shah as proof of foreign exploitation. If the embassy seizure was left outside clerical control, it might have propelled Marxist factions to greater influence. Instead, Khomeini publicly reframed the embassy assault as a divine confrontation, not the work of students acting autonomously. By endorsing their actions, he pulled the political meaning of the takeover inside the orbit of his leadership. Hostages were no longer simply captured Americans. They became symbols of national purification under Islamic guidance. This interpretation closed the space for leftists and liberals to claim the event as their own. The anti-American energy in the streets, which might otherwise have surged toward competing groups, now flowed directly into the clerical faction's advantage. Documents from clerical councils, declassified in recent years, make clear that this was not a passive response. Advisors warned Khomeini that the credibility of Marxist groups among students was rising, thanks to their readiness for confrontation. If silence or suppression followed the embassy breach, leftists would seize the mantle of true revolutionary courage. One memorandum even noted that hesitation could render the clerics suspect, timid in the face of a defining struggle. Khomeini's decision to embrace the takeover directly undercut this danger. The students became followers of the Imam in official discourse, retroactively recast as loyal to his authority rather than independent actors. The immediate political payoff was substantial. Liberal figures who urged moderation or urged a quick end to the hostage ordeal, such as Foreign Minister Sader Gopzadeh, found themselves discredited. Gopzadeh's attempts to negotiate exposed him to charges of weakness, and his political base quickly eroded. In later years, he would fall entirely from favor, his career demolished in part because Khomeini's endorsement left no room for conciliatory approaches. At the same time, Marxist groups who had built influence on uncompromising opposition to the US found their language co-opted by the clerical establishment, stripping them of momentum. From that point, power began to consolidate around Khomeini's interpretation of the revolution. The institutions that sprang up in 1979 and 1980, the revolutionary courts, the committees enforcing order, the emerging constitutional framework, were all drawn into a trajectory defined by clerical authority. Debate inside the revolutionary coalition narrowed as Islamist dominance deepened. What had started as a movement made up of diverse political blocs was forcibly molded into a theocratic system, its legitimacy grounded in opposition to America. The embassy seizure became both proof and catalyst of this transformation. Meanwhile, outside Iran, observers in Washington and European capitals often misunderstood what had happened. To many policymakers, the takeover looked like mob violence later co-opted by clerics, or perhaps an irrational display of revolutionary fervor. Yet in Tehran, the endorsement was anything but irrational. It was a demonstration of control. Khomeini showed his rivals that he could harness outrage against the United States and convert it into political capital. He demonstrated to his supporters that America could be humiliated without reprisal, and he sent a signal to would-be challengers. There was no authority in Iran higher than his word once he claimed the symbolism of defiance. This fluidity in power posed an enormous challenge to US diplomacy. American policymakers struggled to identify who, if anyone, held authority to negotiate. Were the students making decisions on their own? Did moderate officials have any influence? Or was Khomeini himself directing the crisis from beyond direct contact? The pattern soon became obvious. No official carried authority above his unless he allowed it. Emissaries might indicate compromise, only for Khomeini to nullify those hints publicly. By design, decentralized actors remained powerless to conclude the crisis, ensuring that its meaning and control could never drift far from him. This made the hostage crisis more than a matter of bargaining. It redefined the character of the new republic. By presenting defiance of the US as an act of religious duty, Khomeini hardened the ideological divide between clerical Islamism and all rival traditions. Leftists who had once envisioned a socialist revolution were marginalized. Liberals who favored a parliamentary democracy were dismissed as faint-hearted. Moderation itself was portrayed as betrayal. The unity around anti-American rhetoric fused resistance with loyalty to the supreme leader, weaving legitimacy into a structure that excluded compromise. The hostages thus became involuntary participants in Iran's internal consolidation. Blindfolded, bound, and paraded, they functioned less as bargaining chips than as live displays of revolutionary strength. Images broadcast on Iranian and global media carried two messages simultaneously: that Iran could confront the United States directly, and that the confrontation proved the authority of the clerical system. A foreign policy crisis for Washington was in Tehran, a domestic power struggle carried to its conclusion. For the Carter administration, the misreading of Khomeini's motives proved devastating. American officials assumed political pressure inside Iran would drive leaders to resolve the standoff quickly. Instead, every additional week of captivity cemented Khomeini's dominance further. The hostages became proof of a new order rather than tools for negotiation. The possibility of an early settlement diminished sharply once it became clear that prolonging the crisis was itself part of consolidating authority. What looked like intransigence was strategic entrenchment. Diplomatic channels proved ineffective under these conditions. Messages back and forth were consumed by delays and contradictions, frequently undermined by Khomeini overriding interlocutors at the critical moment. Negotiation required recognition of a shared framework for compromise, but he demonstrated repeatedly that the very existence of the crisis was the victory. In this environment, traditional state-to-state diplomacy drifted toward futility. Late 1979 and early 1980, American intelligence assessments began to reflect this reality. Reports circulating within Washington recognized that Iran's leadership had little incentive to end the crisis on terms that could be defined as compromise. The situation forced US officials into a re-evaluation. Could negotiation alone resolve a conflict that was doubling as an ideological pillar of the new Iranian state? It was a question without a reassuring answer. Khomeini's embrace of the students. Action was therefore not a passing show of solidarity, but a deliberate turning point. It reshaped both Iran's political foundation and America's strategic dilemma. For Tehran, it confirmed the clerical monopoly over revolutionary ideals. For Washington, it closed off familiar avenues of engagement and left a vacuum where reliable negotiation should have been. The crisis was no longer just bilateral friction. It was a wider confrontation unfolding on international stages. The next phase would reveal whether outside powers and global institutions had any real leverage against this new order. A world watching powerlessly. The hostage ordeal was never confined to Iran and the United States alone. Very quickly, it became a test for the international system itself, one that the world watched unfold but seemed powerless to influence. All eyes turned to the United Nations, where Secretary General Kurt Waldheim pressed to open dialogue in hopes that his position might unlock an early solution. The UN presented itself as the one body able to stand above ideological battles, but in practice, its influence proved hollow. When Waldheim traveled to Tehran in early January 1980, the atmosphere reflected none of the neutrality international diplomacy requires. Crowds gathered along the streets during his visit, some waving banners in support of the students, others denouncing the UN as a puppet of foreign powers. The reception itself revealed that outside authority held no sway. More tellingly, Waldheim never even secured an audience with Ayatollah Khomeini, nor did he gain access to the hostages whose fate he hoped to address. By the time he left Tehran, empty-handed, it was evident that the United Nations carried no authority capable of penetrating Iran's revolutionary posture. Western envoys who followed faced similar hostility. Reports at the time described scenes of intimidation, from jeering outside gatherings to heavily controlled meetings where intermediaries had little power to negotiate. The message from Tehran was consistent. No external power, including the most prominent international body, could dictate the course of the crisis. The diplomatic machinery designed to preserve stability was sidelined by a revolutionary leadership that gained stature precisely through its defiance of such institutions. Global audiences, these failures carried an unmistakable sting. Footage of UN representatives brushed aside and diplomatic visits ending in stalemate showed that the world's foremost forum had no reach in Tehran. The sense of impotence spread beyond the organization itself, touching European governments that attempted parallel outreach. Early commissions and quiet intermediaries met the same result. No access to the hostages, no leverage with Khomeini, and no shift in Iran's determination. Each attempt ended with public visibility, but no progress behind closed doors, reinforcing the view that the hostages were not chips for trade, but instruments in Iran's domestic transformation. Tehran, meanwhile, was eager to turn this standoff into spectacle. The students holding the embassy did not hide their captives, they displayed them. In publicized forums, they staged accusatory sessions against American imperialism, producing embassy documents as supposed evidence of espionage. These presentations were filmed and circulated to international audiences. However contested the authenticity of the documents might have been, the imagery carried its own power. To skeptical viewers abroad, especially in societies already critical of US foreign policy, Iran positioned itself as the nation that had finally exposed the world's most powerful government as meddling and vulnerable. Conditions inside for the hostages worsened even as television screens filled with these propaganda sessions. The Americans were frequently shifted from one building to another, often in the dead of night, a practice that disoriented them and frustrated any outside attempt at locating them. Former offices became cramped holding cells. Blinds and chains grew more common. The International Red Cross signaled interest in humanitarian inspections, but was denied. Officially, Iran insisted there was no need for foreign oversight. In reality, authorities feared that international monitors might identify hostages, locations, or confirm the conditions they were held under. The refusal sent a stark diplomatic message. International organizations could knock on the door, but inside Iran, only revolutionary committees dictated the rules. This vacuum left other states quietly weighing a role. Algeria stands out in hindsight, though in the early months of 1980 it remained on the periphery. With its own experience of anti-colonial struggle, Algeria held credibility across the Muslim world and carried none of the baggage of Western powers in the Middle East. Some allies of the US floated its possible involvement as an intermediary. Yet at this stage, Iran rebuffed formal outside mediation, preferring the image of open defiance to back-channel compromise. Algeria's broader importance would come later, but in the immediate months following Waldheim's fruitless trip, the world remained on the outside looking in. For Washington, this accumulation of failures carried real consequences. The Carter administration had hoped international mechanisms could shoulder some of the burden. If the UN could not gain ground, if European states offered little traction, and if humanitarian institutions were sidelined, then traditional diplomacy was reduced to shadows. Indirect envoys, secretive messages, and uncertain intermediaries. But those measures risked leaks, embarrassment, and above all the appearance that America was begging for concessions. Each new collapse drained US credibility while extending Iran's propaganda advantage. Inside Carter's circle, patience and pragmatism collided. The president resisted calls for aggressive military retaliation, repeatedly arguing that restraint was the safer course. Yet as 1980 unfolded, the legacy of failed diplomacy pressed harder on the administration. Officials openly debated what remained if every negotiation channel produced the same answer: nothing. The question lingered uncomfortably at the highest levels. Was there any path left short of force? The wider international stage only deepened the contrast. The UN Security Council passed resolutions demanding the immediate release of hostages, but lacking enforcement, these served largely symbolic roles. When pushed, Iranian representatives pointed to their rejection of imperialist institutions as proof of revolutionary purity. In some corners of the global south, especially among populations sensitive to colonial legacies, Iran's refusal to yield gained a curious respect. While Western governments saw defiance of the UN as reckless, others saw it as a small nation thumbing its nose at great powers that had long acted without accountability. For Americans, however, the impact was sharper and more personal, amplified by television. Night after night, millions of households saw images of bound and blindfolded countrymen, while anchor desks reported failed talks and fruitless visits. By the time 1980 was underway, Carter's image as a human rights advocate was overshadowed by nightly reminders of his apparent helplessness. Despite his preference for caution, pressure mounted that diplomacy had not just stalled, but collapsed. That collapse created an opening for military planners. Among advisors, options once considered unthinkable, the use of special forces to penetrate and extract, moved from hypothetical to concrete. Debates turned to logistical feasibility, available equipment, and the risks of escalation. Intelligence agencies compiled assessments, weighing the obstacles stacked against success. Contingency planning accelerated, not because confidence was high, but because few alternatives remained visible. The more the world tried to insert itself, the clearer it became to Washington that mediation offered no release. Iranian leaders showed no interest in bargaining. International institutions proved toothless. For the hostage-takers, outside outrage was not pressure but validation. The longer this spectacle endured, the more it reinforced their authority at home and their defiance abroad. By the early spring of 1980, the Carter administration faced grim arithmetic. Diplomacy had produced no progress. International forums had been dismissed. Humanitarian access was rejected, and the months ticked by with every American captive still in chains. Against that backdrop, the attention in Washington shifted. With no resolution in sight, the next move was no longer another env or appeal through the UN. The crisis was entering a stage where action, not negotiation, would be tested. The United States began to prepare for an operation unlike anything it had ever attempted before. Operation Eagle Claw, the Desert Gamble. Operation Eagle Claw, the American attempt to bring the hostages home by force, became one of the most daring and disastrous missions in U.S. military history. Planned for the spring of 1980, it relied on secrecy, precision, and equipment that had never been tested under such conditions. Responsibility fell to Delta Force, a relatively new unit trained for hostage rescues, supported by Air Force and Marine crews tasked with moving men and machinery thousands of miles into the Iranian desert. The entire plan demanded perfect execution across an enormous distance, with little room for error. The concept was straightforward on paper, but fragile in reality. 8 RH-53D helicopters were launched from the USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea, their mission to ferry commandos deep into Iran. A C-130 transport fleet was scheduled to establish a temporary landing site in the desert, code-named Desert One, where helicopters could refuel before moving closer to Tehran. Pre-positioned vehicles and CIA contacts would guide the assault force toward the capital, where Delta operators would storm the U.S. Embassy compound, secure the hostages, and fly them out for recovery on an airfield captured nearby. The mission required at least 6 fully functioning helicopters to proceed. Anything less risked leaving troops and hostages stranded. In training, the operation appeared feasible. Pilots rehearsed low visibility landings and practiced refueling maneuvers in remote American deserts. Intelligence teams mapped escape routes in Tehran block by block, preparing for navigation under darkness. Every segment of the operation was interdependent. A delay or malfunction in any phase could unravel the entire sequence. Despite the risks, officials believed that the element of surprise and the skill of the special operators gave them a slim but real chance of success. The mission began to falter almost immediately. After liftoff, one RH-53D suffered a hydraulic failure and turned back to the carrier. Another encountered a massive dust storm, the type known locally as a haboob, which caused instruments to fail and blinded pilots struggling to keep formation through walls of sand. Engines ingested dust that strained their performance, and crews battled exhaustion in the churning storm. When the helicopters reached Desert 1, only 6 remained. Soon after landing, mechanical issues made clear that one of those 6 could not continue. That left just 5 aircraft in working condition, below the 6 required to attempt the rescue. The ground itself offered no comfort. Desert 1 was nothing more than a flat dirt strip chosen for its concealment. As Delta Force operators secured the perimeter, they encountered unexpected traffic: a civilian bus transporting passengers and a fuel truck bound for local routes. Both were stopped, but the encounters made secrecy impossible. With Iranian civilians detained under guard and the possibility of word spreading, the chance of surprise was shrinking rapidly. What had begun as a precisely synchronized plan now teetered on collapse. Commanders faced their hardest decision. To push forward with fewer than 6 functioning helicopters would mean entering Tehran without enough lift capacity to bring everyone out. The alternatives were grim: abandon part of the assault team or risk leaving hostages behind. Either option threatened disaster in the heart of the capital. Weighing the odds, the field commander ordered the raid aborted. Units began repositioning for withdrawal, preparing to refuel under cover of night before departing Iran's desert interior. Disaster struck during that retreat. In the dusty darkness, one RH-53D hover taxied to refuel and drifted too close to an EC-130 transport aircraft on the ground. Its rotor sliced into the C-130's fuselage, triggering a massive fireball that ignited both aircraft. The explosion killed 8 American service members, 5 Air Force crew and 3 Marines, and injured others nearby. Flames lit the desert sky, turning the secret staging ground into a scene of chaos. Operators scrambled to evacuate, abandoning helicopters and equipment in their rush to escape. The wreckage and bodies were left behind. The news reached Washington before dawn. President Carter and his advisors had gambled on Eagle Claw as their one chance to shift the crisis, but instead the failure underscored American limits. Televised images of twisted metal in the desert and jubilant celebrations in Tehran quickly followed, transforming tragedy into propaganda for Iran's leaders. State-controlled media declared that divine power had crippled America's attempt. Ayatollah Khomeini himself framed the explosion as proof that the revolution was invincible. Crowds echoed that message in chants across the capital. The political cost in Washington was immediate. Allies who had counseled diplomacy looked on with concern at America's inability to execute its own plan. Intelligence assessments, later declassified, showed senior officials had been warned that the mission carried an estimated chance of success below 15%. Equipment reliability, weather hazards, and the complexity of coordinating so many moving parts undermined the operation from the start. Yet mounting domestic pressure to act, and the collapse of every diplomatic alternative made the attempt irresistible. Once failure came, however, it was seen less as boldness than as incompetence. Carter's political opponents seized on the images of abandonment in the desert as proof of weakness, and the debacle fed directly into the charged atmosphere of an election year. Inside the armed forces, Eagle Claw became an enduring study in what happens when organizational structures do not match ambitious objectives. The Holloway Commission, created immediately after the failure, examined the mission in detail. Its report highlighted problems in equipment selection, inadequate joint training, and the absence of a unified command authority to coordinate special operations across the military branches. Out of these lessons came structural reforms that permanently reshaped U.S. capabilities. The eventual creation of U.S. Special Operations Command, the Joint Special Operations Command, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They all traced their origins to failures exposed at Desert One. What had been a calamity in 1980 became the foundation for America's modern counter-terrorism infrastructure. For the hostages, the failed rescue attempt brought only grim consequences. Guards at the embassy compounds heard aircraft overhead that night, realizing that some form of foreign intervention had been attempted. In response, security tightened dramatically. Captives were relocated more often, sometimes kept in solitary confinement, shackled, or placed in harsher conditions to reduce the risk of further rescue efforts. The faint hope of liberation by force was extinguished. Families waiting back home were left to absorb dual tragedies: months of continuing captivity and the loss of 8 service members who had died attempting the impossible. Iran's leadership capitalized on the failure. State media broadcast images of wrecked U.S. equipment and celebrated the Americans who had died in the desert. Religious leaders described the flames at Desert One as a sign of divine favor. Khomeini himself used the incident to emphasize that God had defended the revolution against the most powerful military on earth. For Iranians loyal to the new order, Eagle Claw became proof that resistance against foreign pressure was not only survivable, but triumphant. By the middle of 1980, Washington had to accept that no military shortcut would solve the standoff. Negotiations would have to resume, but now with fewer options and less leverage. The failure made clear that bold gestures could collapse under the weight of logistics and environment, leaving only propaganda victories for Tehran. While this mission ended in ashes, another, very different effort was unfolding at the same moment, one relying not on helicopters or firepower, but on discretion, intelligence, and quiet coordination behind closed doors. The Canadian caper, a rare triumph. While the United States absorbed the fallout from its failed military strike, another effort was already unfolding that proved far more effective, though on a smaller scale. Known as the Canadian Caper, it involved 6 Americans who had escaped capture during the embassy takeover. In hiding across Tehran, their survival depended on secrecy and improvisation. If they were found, Iranian authorities would almost certainly treat them as spies. Unlike the 52 held inside the embassy, their very existence outside captivity was unknown to Tehran, and that gave a narrow chance for an audacious escape. On November 4, 1979, amid the chaos of the embassy breach, the 6 managed to slip into the city streets. In the hours and days that followed, they faced the grim reality that no American safe houses remained. They moved nervously between sympathetic contacts until protection finally came from an unlikely source: Canada's diplomatic mission. Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor, along with his deputy John Sheridan, made the decision to hide them in secure residences under their own authority. It was an act of extraordinary personal risk. Both knew that discovery would mean an end not only to their careers, but likely to their lives. The homes of Canada's representatives became the shelter of last resort, where curtains stayed drawn, routines were altered, and even footsteps inside had to be disguised as ordinary diplomatic life. For weeks, Taylor's team lived a double existence. Publicly, they continued daily functions as foreign envoys in post-revolutionary Tehran. Privately, they rationed food, kept the Americans indoors, and struggled with the constant fear that a neighbor, a patrol, or even a careless mistake could betray the secret. Iranian security units were conducting methodical searches, sweeping through hotels and neighborhoods to account for embassy staff. Reports already indicated that missing Americans were being hunted. Taylor and his staff understood that simply waiting for the situation to settle was no option. Each week in hiding increased the chances of discovery. By late December, the plan emerged for what would be remembered as the Canadian Caper. Canada gave the mission its most daring commitment. issuing false Canadian passports for the 6 escapees. To coordinate, the CIA dispatched Tony Mendez, a specialist in exfiltration and disguise. At that time, Mendez's role and the CIA's involvement were highly classified and remained a secret for years. It would only be publicly credited decades later when documents were declassified in the late 1990s. In the moment, the risk fell heavily on Canada, the only nation openly exposed if the operation failed. The plan hinged on a striking deception. Instead of posing as diplomats, which might immediately raise suspicion, the 6 would be disguised as a Canadian film crew scouting locations for a science fiction movie. A fictitious studio was constructed complete with letterhead, plausible backstory, and a film title designed to match industry trends. Passports, business cards, and travel papers identified the 6 as professionals in the entertainment industry. Under Mendez's guidance, they practiced their cover stories, how to explain technical film equipment, how to describe production schedules, where their company was headquartered. Their greatest shield would be their ability to act casual and confident under scrutiny. The date chosen for the escape was January 28, 1980. On that morning, Taylor and Mendez escorted the disguised group to Mehrabad Airport. Each detail along the route carried potential disaster. Checkpoints, routine ID requests, and even a suspicious passerby could have unraveled the entire design. At the airport itself, the Americans adopted deliberately ordinary behavior, as if they were bored travelers complaining about delays. They handed over their forged Canadian passports. What followed would later be described by participants as the tensest minutes of their lives. Officials inspecting each photograph, each visa stamp, each signature. Documents released later show how close the scrutiny came. Security officers questioned the unfamiliar Canadian identities and leafed through their paperwork longer than expected. A hesitation here, a second glance there, it could have ended everything. But the stamps were applied, the passports handed back, and the 6 were waved to board. Moments later, the aircraft took off, carrying them safely out of Iranian airspace. Only when the plane's wheels left the runway could anyone allow themselves to speak freely. The Canadian caper had succeeded. News of the escape broke only after the 6 reached safety. Canada received immediate and widespread praise. Newspapers framed the rescue as a bold and selfless decision by a smaller nation that had stepped into peril where larger powers faltered. The image of Ken Taylor as the central figure became a symbol of practical courage. The Canadian government faced questions from its own parliament about authorizing forged passports and harboring fugitives, but the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. To Canadians, it became an extraordinary moment of national pride, often recalled as the country's most daring Cold War operation. In Washington, the reaction was more complicated. Relief at the 6 diplomats, survival was unmistakable, but the contrast with Operation Eagle Claw was painful. While the US military had failed at enormous cost, a small ally had succeeded through diplomacy, improvisation, and precise deception. President Carter praised Canada publicly and expressed genuine gratitude to Taylor privately. At the same time, the imbalance in perception was obvious. Within weeks, the world was celebrating the quiet success of Canada, while America's headlines focused on its own failed attempt and the hostages still held in Tehran. Hollywood would later seize on the story with the film Argo, dramatizing Mendez's disguise operation. That version, while popular, portrayed only parts of the historical reality. The airport passage, for instance, was nerve-wracking but not accompanied by dramatic car chases. The Canadian role, especially the decision to issue passports and risk embassy residencies, was understated in the film. In truth, without that choice, no plan could have been attempted. For Mendez and the CIA, operational credit remained hidden until declassification decades later. For Canadians, the recognition came instantly and cemented the episode as an enduring symbol of diplomatic bravery. Despite the escape, the larger crisis continued unchanged. 52 hostages remained inside Iran, with no sign that Tehran would relent. The Canadian caper was a moral victory, but but its numerical scale was small. Even as it altered public narratives, the strategic reality did not shift. Iran retained its leverage. The Carter administration still had no pathway to resolution. The crisis stretched through 1980, with Washington increasingly desperate for intermediaries who could communicate in ways direct channels had failed. The Canadian operation demonstrated that success came from agility, trust, and improvisation, but also that such opportunities were rare. Once the six reached freedom, attention returned to the unresolved majority. With both military options and conventional diplomacy stalled, American officials turned to countries outside the Western Bloc, searching for someone who might hold influence in Tehran without provoking its defiance. From those margins emerged a possible mediator whose revolutionary history and international standing offered unique credibility. It would be through that unexpected channel that the final stages of negotiation began to take shape. Algeria steps into the shadows. Algeria's role in the hostage crisis emerged slowly and quietly, but in time it became indispensable. The country was an unlikely candidate on the surface, neither an ally of Washington nor a declared partner of Tehran, but its history carried weight. Having fought its own violent war of liberation against French colonial rule, Algeria enjoyed credibility that Western capitals lacked. Iran's leaders, steeped in revolutionary rhetoric, recognized within Algeria a peer, a Muslim nation that had defied foreign domination and prevailed. It carried none of the baggage of monarchs aligned with Washington, nor the taint of European powers. For clerics surrounding Ayatollah Khomeini, that distinction meant Algeria could be treated with respect instead of suspicion. By the summer of 1980, pressure was intensifying among US allies to find a way forward. European governments, especially West Germany, urged Algeria to explore its position as a discreet intermediary. Institutions like the United Nations had been rebuffed. Direct American overtures went unanswered. Iranian factions consistently used hostility toward the West to fortify their position at home. Algeria, by contrast, had credentials from the non-aligned movement and a reputation for having resisted Western influence. If anyone could navigate Tehran's political sensitivities, it was Algiers. Out of this context, Algeria began its role as behind-the-scenes facilitator. Unlike the highly visible initiatives that met brick walls, Algerian diplomacy relied on silence. Exchanges did not take place through microphones or photo opportunities, but through unmarked courier flights and late-night meetings. American proposals reached Tehran in sealed envelopes carried by Algerian officials, often via Algiers. Responses returned the same way, word for word. In an era before secure digital channels, each communication required hours of travel and days of waiting. Diplomats became literal messengers of trust. The slowness was agonizing for Washington, but it was the only path either side would accept. Inside Iran, Algeria's credibility was embodied by Abdelkrim Guerre, Algeria's ambassador in Tehran. Through patient dealings, he cultivated direct links to Ahmad Khomeini, son of the Ayatollah and a trusted conduit into the most influential offices of the clerical system. Unlike earlier envoys who found themselves entangled among student hardliners or sidelined by competing committees, Guerre had a line of communication that reached the Ayatollah himself. This bypass allowed Algeria to serve as the first reliable mechanism for American messages to reach the authority that mattered most. For the Carter administration, relying on Algeria was both frustrating and necessary. The process was slow, subject to long pauses and deliberate hesitations from Tehran. Each response lagged by weeks. Each small clarification required another flight across continents, yet there was no alternative. By mid-1980, Algeria became the sole bridge sustaining dialogue between Washington and Tehran. Events sharpened in September 1980 when Khomeini's government formalized its stance. On September 13, he announced 4 conditions for the hostages' release: the return of the Shah's property and wealth to Iran, the lifting of American sanctions, a guarantee by the United States to never interfere again in Iranian affairs, and the unfreezing of Iranian financial assets abroad. These demands provided the framework for all subsequent exchanges Algeria carried between the parties. They hardened Tehran's commitment while forcing Washington to assess what concessions it could afford politically and legally. The United States responded through intermediaries in Algiers, where negotiations were led by Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher. American officials met with Algerian diplomats repeatedly, crafting language that carefully addressed Iran's conditions without conceding so much that it would shatter U.S. credibility. Algeria relayed drafts to Tehran, then returned with counterproposals that kept the process inching forward. The shuttling of documents, sometimes no more than a few pages of phrasing adjustments, became the rhythm of this hidden diplomacy. Over late 1980, financial settlements grew central to potential agreement. Iran demanded its blocked assets be made accessible before the hostages could be freed. Algeria brokered a solution that balanced Iranian insistence with legal security for American institutions. The final arrangement provided that approximately $7.955 billion of Iranian funds would be deposited at the Bank of England into escrow accounts, supervised by Algeria. These funds were earmarked both for the return of Iranian property and for resolving claims brought against Iran by American entities. The structure gave Iran assurance it would recover billions withheld by U.S. sanctions, while protecting American companies and banks with an orderly process through a new tribunal. These financial specifics underscored Algeria's role as facilitator rather than enforcer. It was not Algiers dictating terms, but rather brokering formulas that both sides could accept. Iranian leaders trusted Algerians to guard against deception by Washington. American negotiators trusted Algerians to ensure that assets would not vanish into Tehran's control without the hostages' release. The very balance of mistrust required Algeria's neutrality to hold. Meanwhile, Washington faced a political clock it could not escape. Carter's re-election campaign faltered under the shadow of the crisis. Advisors in his circle admitted privately that the hostages would likely not be freed before the vote. Tehran's leaders understood the calendar as well, and delay worked to their advantage. Each passing week humiliated Washington further. U.S. officials pressed Algerians for progress, but in Tehran, decisions were intentionally postponed. Khomeini resisted granting Carter the credit of resolving the affair on his watch. Still, the Algerian effort persisted. Gherib in Tehran and his colleagues in Algiers endured shuttle after shuttle, redrafting language late at night, framing terms in ways acceptable to revolutionary ears. They built phrases substituting legalistic American concepts with more political language for Iran's consumption. American lawyers re-rendered Iran's forceful demands into contractual guarantees. Algerians managed the translation functions skillfully, adjusting tone and emphasis without altering substance. This laborious phrasing work, obscure as it looked from the outside, gradually turned clashing declarations into workable text. By December 1980, outlines of what would become the Algiers Accords had solidified. Release of the hostages in exchange for the unfreezing of Iranian assets and guarantees against U.S. interference in Iran's future. Still, signatures were withheld. Carter followed progress closely, yet Algerian diplomats signaled again and again that Tehran refused to finalize the deal during his presidency. Their shuttle missions delivered the same stalling messages, even as technical details neared completion. As January 1981 approached, Algerians intensified their traveling and carrying of draft agreements to prevent collapse. American officials in Algiers, led by Christopher, spent long nights waiting for responses only Tehran could give. The prisoner release logistics were arranged with Algerian coordination, right down to the aircraft that would ferry hostages out under Algerian supervision. But Tehran timed its acceptance so that Carter would never see the hostages freed on his watch. On the very day Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, Algerian intermediaries oversaw the transfer, with 52 Americans flown first to Algiers before continuing home. Algeria remained absent from celebratory headlines, But its role was decisive. Without its credibility, the two governments would have had no mechanism to exchange and refine proposals. Without its financial supervision, neither trust nor transfer would have been possible. Yet Algeria could not dictate the pace. The outcome came only when Iran's leaders chose the moment. For Washington, it meant a bitter handover. For Algiers, it marked a rare instance when a non-aligned state transformed its revolutionary credentials into quiet diplomatic authority. Behind the public images of aircraft departing Tehran and landing to safety, the Algerian story was about patience and translation, couriers and conversations, and repeated insistence that even adversaries could use intermediaries to avoid collapse. But while Algeria mediated across capitals, the Americans still inside Iran endured the consequences. Their experience was measured not in communiques or financial transfers, but in the daily strain of captivity, where survival came one day at a time inside locked rooms. It is to that human ordeal that attention must now turn. Hostages, ordeal, inside the 444 days. Captivity for the 52 Americans taken in Tehran stretched across 444 days, a span long enough to strip away normal routines and erode basic orientation. From the first hours, their environment was defined by disorientation, blindfolds at meals, during movement between rooms, and throughout interrogations. Guards deliberately kept them uncertain of day and time, often leaving hostages unsure of whether it was morning or midnight. The loss of that simplest reference point became as punishing as the physical restraints. Daily captivity tactics. The treatment varied from guard to guard, but shared common themes of coercion and fear. Interrogations could escalate to shouting, staged threats, or mock judgments meant to suggest execution was imminent. Research conducted later confirmed accounts of prolonged solitary confinement, with some captives reporting up to 9 months in sealed rooms no larger than a closet, often with only a mattress and bare walls. Many were relocated repeatedly around Tehran and even into provincial cities, a measure designed to prevent outside rescue attempts. Guards reminded them that the United States was powerless to intervene, pressing the idea that they might spend their entire lives as prisoners. Recording denunciations of American policy was another tactic. Those forced statements were sometimes replayed mockingly to their authors. The deprivation extended beyond threats. Winter nights often left prisoners shivering in unheated quarters. Meals were irregular, sometimes little more than bread and tea. Blindfolds prevented even the reassurance of eye contact during transfers or interrogations. Several survivors later testified that prolonged sensory disorientation, always being pushed suddenly into new rooms with no warning, was the most corrosive aspect of the experience. The monotony itself became a form of punishment, leavened only by bursts of intimidation. For some, the sheer isolation broke quickly into despair. Accounts collected later detail a range of coping attempts. A few began hunger strikes, briefly reclaiming control over one aspect of their captivity, though these were met with harsher conditions until food was resumed. Others attempted to memorize details of embassy documents glimpsed before capture, reasoning that one day they might testify to refute charges of espionage laid against them. These small acts became forms of resistance, asserting individual dignity against the sense that they had been reduced to utensils of propaganda. The guards themselves presented a shifting mix of hostility and ambivalence. Early on, students assigned to oversee the prisoners often displayed revolutionary zeal, staging loud denunciations and dramatized lectures. But over time, the burden of constant supervision produced cracks. In interviews years later, some admitted that seeing the toll of captivity on older diplomats troubled them, men wasting away in small rooms, kept from communication or light. A few even expressed regret, acknowledging they acted less as individuals than as enforcers of a revolution that demanded human bargaining chips. Coping mechanisms for survival. Inside that environment, prisoners improvised systems that gave structure to an otherwise formless existence. Some developed crude calendars by scratching marks into walls or furniture, determined to measure days even when guards tried to erase their sense of time. Religious prayer provided cadence for hours otherwise indistinguishable from one another. Others, recalling literature or passages of history, rehearsed them mentally as a form of exercise, to keep their minds occupied when their bodies had no freedom. Coded communication emerged as one of the few ways to sustain connection. Taps against walls, whispered encouragement when blindfolds slipped, or small objects left in recognizable positions became signals of solidarity. These gestures may have appeared insignificant at the time, but later narratives by survivors revealed them as essential lifelines. Through them, captives confirmed that their community had not been completely dismantled, that each individual was not alone in bearing the burden. Reuniting after their eventual release brought to light just how many of these strategies converged. Diplomats compared crude carvings used to count days, storytellers recounted how they had retold novels in their minds, and younger staff admitted how one whispered phrase at the right moment eased what felt like endless night. Survival was rarely dramatic. It consisted of holding fast to the smallest routines, endlessly repeated in confined spaces, until weeks became months and months stretched into more than a year. The costs remained enormous long after freedom. Research conducted decades later showed hostages carried psychological wounds consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, recurring nightmares, insomnia, lasting suspicion of authority, and bursts of anxiety triggered by ordinary sounds like slamming doors. Depression and withdrawal from professional and social life were common. For some, captivity hardened into bitterness, against their captors, against Tehran itself, and even against Washington for failing to protect them or secure quicker release. For others, the ordeal redirected life paths. Former hostages entered careers advocating for prevention policies or working in security fields, convinced that their experience underscored the need for stronger safeguards. The American public never fully saw these interior battles. On nightly broadcasts, what appeared were blindfolded parades or photographs staged for propaganda. Missing from those images were the quiet degradations, endless transfers, solitary nights without light, fear of execution whispered through locked doors. Families back home received only fragments confirming their loved ones were still alive. The gap between what played in public and what was endured privately was immense. Perspectives inside Iran also shifted over time. Some of the student guards later admitted their unease, acknowledging that holding exhausted, disoriented diplomats at gunpoint war against basic conscience. Memoirs reveal conflict between the pride of having defied America and the guilt of seeing broken individuals paraded for political spectacle. These retrospective accounts highlight how the revolution's self-image, championing independence against the United States, was built on a foundation of human suffering that unsettled even some who enforced it. The crisis remains an example of how high-level geopolitics translated directly into daily human cost. Each delay in negotiations, each shift in policy, filtered immediately into the hostages' conditions. Another transfer, another month in solitary, another round of staged denunciations. For Iran, the captives symbolized defiance. For America, their captivity symbolized weakness. But for the 52 individuals living it, the meaning was defined by survival through endurance and by scars that persisted long after their chains were removed. When measured by governments, the crisis is remembered in terms of negotiations, accords, and shifting leverage. When measured by those inside locked rooms, the crisis was 444 days reduced to counting scratches on walls, whispering to neighbors through partitions, and fighting despair one day at a time. Their ordeal reminds us that between nations' rhetoric and public postures lies a human ledger of cost, played out in silence, yet lasting for lifetimes. That silence was not confined to their cells. Every calculation in Washington and Tehran that prolonged the crisis bore economic consequences powerful enough to reshape global markets. The next chapter unfolded not in hidden rooms, but in the open realm of policy, where the price of oil, sanctions, and financial weapons became a central battlefield. oil, sanctions, and the cost of defiance. Economic pressure became the most visible front in Washington's struggle as military and diplomatic avenues produced little progress. On April 7, 1980, President Carter announced a sweeping set of measures: an embargo on trade, the severing of diplomatic relations, and the freezing of several $billion in Iranian assets held in U.S. banks. Officials framed these steps as sharp signals that the United States would not remain passive. Oil, the foundation of Iran's wealth, stood at the center of this campaign. Sanctions, they argued, would squeeze Tehran until its leaders accepted a negotiated release of the hostages. It was an option that promised firmness without an escalation to war, visible enough for American audiences, yet calculated to avoid dangerous direct confrontation. The global effects were immediate. Energy markets, already strained by the Iranian Revolution and the fall of the Shah, grew even more unstable. Embargoes from Washington threatened to deepen volatility. Oil-dependent economies in Europe and Asia faced climbing costs. In the United States, consumers saw gasoline prices rise almost overnight, and the public frustration merged with the psychological shock of nightly images of blindfolded hostages. Across the Western world, lines at fuel stations and rising inflation kept the crisis present in daily life far from Tehran. Inside Iran, the impact was sharp but uneven. Inflation accelerated rapidly, wages stagnated, and shortages of imported items spread quickly across cities. Families queued for food staples and medicine, and the value of salaries dropped alarmingly. Yet the consequences did not match Washington's hopes of political collapse. Iran still controlled the resource that everyone needed, oil, and buyers outside the Western Bloc were willing to ignore U.S. sanctions. Crude moved through regional intermediaries, resold at discounts, and was carried by tankers flagged under other states. Smuggling expanded into full networks that depended on third countries and shadow contracts. Oil revenues did decline, but they did not vanish, and Tehran retained enough cash to sustain basic governance and hold its revolutionary structures intact. Declassified Treasury records provide a telling glimpse of how officials actually assessed the measures in real time. Reports from 1980 and 1981 acknowledged that the sanctions hurt Iran's economy but stopped short of crippling it. Non-Western demand guaranteed a steady flow of funds. Publicly, Carter's administration spoke of cutting Iran off entirely from the global system. Privately, officials admitted revenue streams had adjusted, and that sanctions alone could not force an immediate release of hostages. The political paradox became clear. On the one hand, Iranians endured more scarcity and disruption than before. Prices soared and black markets multiplied, enriching networks tied directly to clerics and to the Revolutionary Guards. On the other hand, the regime adapted politically by reframing the sanctions as proof that America was at war with ordinary Iranians. Tehran used ration books, controlled distribution of necessities, and state propaganda to reinforce a narrative that survival in the face of hardship was loyalty to the revolution. Instead of undermining the clerical regime, sanctions allowed its leaders to turn economic pain into political capital. Ordinary frustration was redirected outward against the United States, while those closest to the new order often profited from black market routes. Unexpectedly, the economic campaign fostered long-term techniques of adaptation. Systems built during 1980 disguised oil exports, intermediaries operating through friendly states, and unofficial banking channels formed the first patterns of what later analysts called sanctions busting. These networks survived well beyond the hostage crisis, becoming a permanent feature of Iran's economic strategy under future rounds of international pressure. What Washington intended as short-term coercion laid the groundwork for a state economy capable of operating in parallel to official systems. Still, the U.S. commitment had consequences. American officials created whole bureaucratic frameworks to monitor sanctions, track financial flows, and prepare mechanisms for releasing frozen funds if a deal emerged. This infrastructure expanded over the months of negotiations, laying down methods that future administrations would inherit. Seen from the long perspective, the hostage crisis marked a turning point. Sanctions became established as core tools of American foreign policy, even though evidence at the time showed they could not achieve quick release by themselves. Statistics from the period capture the strain, but also the limits. By 1980, Iran's inflation rate had doubled, many factories shut due to lack of spare parts, and imports of medicine and technology dwindled. Black market trading thrived, often through networks connected to those with political influence. Wealth clustered in the hands of intermediaries who could smuggle or reroute resources around restrictions. Citizens bore the brunt of shortages, yet the ruling elite expanded its control. Economic warfare harmed daily life without breaking command over the state. For ordinary Americans, the sanctions' visibility was tied less to Iranian suffering than to domestic economic consequences. Gasoline costs and heating bills climbed. Inflation aggravated frustration, already high after years of stagflation. Carter's re-election campaign struggled to escape the perception that the country was both humiliated abroad and squeezed at home. Every escalation against Iran was domestically visible through prices, even as it left the hostage standoff unchanged. The hostage families bore a peculiar cost of the sanctions policy. Every announcement of new restrictions created hope that Iran would soon release its captives rather than withstand the pressure. Yet day after day, the situation inside Tehran remained static for those imprisoned, deepening the sense of futility. At home, Americans heard promises that economic pressure would work. In Iran, captives saw no change, an agonizing gap between expectation and reality. Financial bargaining highlighted the closing chapters of the confrontation. While sanctions pressed from the outside, negotiations through Algeria focused on precisely how frozen assets would be handled if the hostages were freed. Out of the nearly $12 billion in Iranian assets blocked in 1979-80, both sides eventually agreed on a structured resolution. About $7.956 billion will be transferred to escrow accounts supervised at the Bank of England, under Algeria's oversight, to guarantee repayment of debts and return of Iranian wealth once captives were released. This arrangement gave Tehran access to funds while reassuring Washington and private claimants that obligations would be resolved through controlled mechanisms. It was a financial settlement as much as a diplomatic one, showing how deeply the crisis had fused money with politics. The lesson emerged starkly. Sanctions carried real costs for Iran, yet in the time frame of a hostage crisis, they did not deliver decisive leverage. They reshaped markets, penalized citizens, and pressed governments, but they also drove structural adaptation and hardened narratives of defiance. Both governments internalized those lessons, Washington institutionalizing economic coercion, Tehran embedding strategies to resist it. The 444 days of confrontation thus became a proving ground for methods that continue to define U.S. Iran relations long after the hostages were gone. Yet while these measures strained economies and restructured policy, they did not change the central political standoff. As 1980 gave way to 1981, the hostages remained imprisoned. The sanctions had reshaped Iran's economy and rattled Western markets, but the confrontation itself dragged on unchanged. That endurance came to rest not only on embargoes and financial negotiations, but ultimately on the political timetable in Washington. From Carter's failure to Reagan's leverage. By 1980, the shadow of the Tehran hostage crisis stretched over almost every aspect of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Each press conference, each international visit, each round of foreign policy discussions circled back to the 52 American captives. What began as a diplomatic confrontation soon became the central measure of his leadership at home. With nightly television showing blindfolded diplomats under guard, public confidence drained steadily. By the fall campaign season, the crisis had come to define not only Carter's foreign policy, but his political survival. Iran's leadership understood the leverage in timing as much as in substance. For them, the hostages symbolized more than prisoners. They were instruments of pressure. Tehran recognized that drawing out the standoff eroded Carter's ability to present himself as a strong leader. Records from the period show that rather than rushing towards settlement, advisors around Ayatollah Khomeini recommended using the American election cycle to their advantage, with release deliberately postponed until after the outcome. The calculation was clear. Withholding resolution maximized Carter's vulnerability and demonstrated the revolution's ability to influence US politics directly. That strategy proved effective. Carter's campaign trail offered little respite, as nearly every question from voters, activists, or journalists circled back to the hostages. Confidence in his administration, already fragile from economic turmoil, appeared paralyzed. Each passing week of captivity reinforced the sense of stalemate. Tehran's tactic of postponement meant that Carter carried the unresolved crisis like political ballast into every debate and interview. At the same time, Ronald Reagan's campaign projected a very different posture. His speeches hinted that he would not show the same restraint that Carter had emphasized. To Tehran, this rhetoric suggested that prolonging the crisis into a Reagan presidency might bring extra risks. If Carter looked predictable and cautious, Reagan appeared unpredictable and potentially confrontational. This shift in tone subtly influenced Tehran's strategy. Continuing to hold the hostages undermined Carter, but keeping them after a handover of power risked provoking a more dangerous confrontation. Throughout late 1980, Algerian negotiators found themselves shuttling with growing urgency between Washington and Tehran. Their work involved weeks of moves and countermoves, drafting language that satisfied demands from both capitals. American officials pressed for a resolution that Carter could deliver before leaving office. Iran resisted. Each Algerian courier flight carried not final agreements, but incremental edits, small changes to financial frameworks, legal terms, or political assurances. The pace was agonizing, but the central dynamic held. Iran would delay the last step to ensure Carter did not leave office with the crisis resolved. The most contentious questions revolved around money and legal guarantees. Billions in Iranian assets remained frozen in US banks under Carter's April 1980 order. Iranian officials demanded their unfreezing and wanted assurances those assets could not be seized after release. US negotiators, working with American banks and legal specialists, insisted on safeguards that tied the timing of financial transfers precisely to the hostages, freedom and earmarked funds for outstanding claims. Discussions bogged down in technicalities, which accounts would be unfrozen first, how financial disputes would be adjudicated, and what legal instruments ensured compliance. Escrow arrangements under neutral supervision emerged as the only bridge, with Algeria eventually designing a system managed through the Bank of England. Roughly $7.956 billion was allocated through these accounts, releasing Iranian assets while protecting American debt claims. By early January 1981, the Algiers Accords framework had been written into near-final form. Its essential pillars were straightforward. Iran would free the American hostages, the United States would unfreeze assets and pledge non-interference in Iranian affairs, and future disputes would be handled through an international tribunal. The terms combined both political assurances and tightly structured financial procedures. Yet despite the agreement in substance, Iran continued to delay the final political signal. Algerian envoys described marathon sessions dragging late into the night, where a sentence adjustment or procedural objection kept signature and execution on hold. For Carter, the final days were grueling. From the Oval Office, he tracked each set of Algerian reports, pressing aides for progress. He desperately hoped to announce the hostages, release himself before leaving office. But as January 19 turned to January 20, Tehran held back. Iranian decision-makers chose to synchronize their final approval not with the completion of negotiations, but with the official transition of power in Washington. The climax came with remarkable precision. On January 20, 1981, as Reagan completed his oath on the steps of the Capitol, planes in Tehran lifted off carrying the 52 hostages. Minutes separated the two events. Algeria managed the coordinated transfers, escorting freed Americans to Algiers before onward flights home. Carter learned of their departure as a private citizen returning to Georgia after leaving office. The message was unmistakable. Iran would not grant him the closure of presiding over their release. This deliberate timing underscored Tehran's intent. The revolution's leaders had not only held Americans in captivity for 444 days, but had used the moment of release itself as a political weapon. Carter's inability to claim resolution reinforced the image of American weakness that defined his final year. Reagan, by sheer timing, received the symbolic advantage of beginning his presidency with the crisis visibly ended. For Washington, the substance of the Algiers Accords, as much about escrow and pledges as diplomacy, merged almost inseparably with the political theater of Inauguration Day. Algeria received acknowledgement as mediator, but the agreements it carried were overshadowed by the spectacle of timing. What mattered most in the global perception was that Iran had dictated when the episode closed. For the United States, it was a sobering lesson that foreign crises could directly shape domestic politics. Carter's determined restraint, intended to avoid greater disaster, yielded little credit. Reagan's tough posture, untested at that point, benefited from an outcome engineered in Tehran. The hostage crisis thus ended not with a single handshake or declaration, but with a complex exchange. The Algiers Accords signed into force, billions held in escrow accounts overseas, and the US committing formally not to intervene again in Iran's internal affairs. But it also ended with enduring political consequence. The way it closed shaped how Washington understood the risks of being entangled in hostage diplomacy. 444 days of captivity left a legacy of caution in American strategy, where leaders assessed not just the lives at stake abroad, but the potential consequences for politics at home. The decision to delay release until minutes after inauguration hardened the perception that timing was a weapon as critical as rhetoric or money. It was this perception, forged in January 1981, that would echo in every later confrontation where Americans fell into hostile custody. The hostages' return concluded one chapter of U.S. Iran confrontation, but it also set the template for what followed. Carter's experience and Reagan's first-day advantage became fixed in memory as examples of how hostage diplomacy could topple a presidency and shape policy. That blueprint endured, carrying forward into future decades as both governments and their adversaries refined the practice of captives as leverage. It was not only the ordeal itself, but also its ending that etched the lessons of power, patience, and political timing into American doctrine. Those lessons created an aftershock that defined US thinking for years. The crisis did not simply release 52 individuals. It restructured perceptions of strength, vulnerability, and negotiation. The experience became a benchmark, one invoked whenever later crises tested Washington. And it left a number forever tied to memory: 444 days, an ordeal whose impact stretched far beyond the hostages who survived it. Legacy, blueprint for modern hostage diplomacy. The lessons of the Tehran hostage crisis became etched not only in memory, but in the machinery of statecraft. What unfolded between 1979 and 1981 created templates that shaped institutions, military doctrine, and diplomacy long after the hostages returned. The episode was not filed away as an anomaly. It became a permanent point of reference for how the United States confronted adversaries and how adversaries calculated leverage. One of the most direct changes came in the military. Operation Eagle Claw's collapse at Desert One forced leaders to confront the absence of a unified system for unconventional missions. The Holloway Report, commissioned immediately afterward, dissected the failure in sharp detail. It cited the lack of a single command authority, poor coordination among service branches, and inadequate preparation for operating in austere environments. Those findings spurred the creation of structures that did not exist before. Within a few years, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, was formed to provide reliable airlift for future special missions. Later, in 1987, the establishment of United States Special Operations Command, USSOCO, brought all special operations units under unified leadership. Military historians trace both directly back to Eagle Claw. A failed rescue in the desert reshaped the very architecture of US military capabilities, creating units that would later spearhead operations in Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The Holloway Report did more than critique. It crystallized an understanding that special operations required dedicated equipment, specialized training, and consistent rehearsals in environments similar to potential theaters of conflict. Its pages detailed how inter-service rivalries and incompatible planning had cost lives. That official acknowledgement gave future reforms weight, allowing Congress and military leaders to justify investments in new capabilities. For military professionals, Desert One became a case study in how failure could reform doctrine. The significance was not only in what happened in 1980, but also in the enduring reminder that hostages and the potential need for rapid rescue would always be a possibility in unstable regions. Economic statecraft also evolved. During the crisis, Carter's April 1980 sanctions froze Iranian assets in US banks, marking one of the largest financial seizures against a foreign government up to that point. Though the sanctions did not compel immediate release of the hostages, they revealed the potential of financial tools as instruments of leverage. After the crisis, Washington did not abandon them. Instead, sanctions became normalized as a structured policy instrument. Dedicated offices within the Treasury and State Departments were established to oversee foreign assets, track illicit transactions, and enforce restrictions. What began as emergency actions against Iran hardened into a standing component of foreign policy, refined with legal authorities that allowed US administrations to strike at adversaries, financial systems as a matter of routine. From the 1980s onward, sanctions spread far beyond Iran to Libya, Iraq, North Korea, and Russia. A foreign policy tool improvised under the stress of captivity became institutionalized, creating a bureaucracy that endures into the present day. Diplomatic and security doctrines shifted as well. For foreign service officers, the Tehran ordeal became the first line of instruction. Students at the Foreign Service Institute were taught to view embassy compounds not as untouchable sanctuaries, but as vulnerable targets. The era when embassies doubled as open cultural centers effectively ended. From the mid-1980s onward, new US diplomatic facilities were constructed as hardened fortress embassies, complete with secure perimeters, guarded compounds, and rapid reaction security units. The idea of diplomats mingling freely with host populations without layered defenses faded under the long shadow of Tehran. Training across the military and diplomatic corps began to include survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SEER, programs tailored to the possibility of captivity. The narrative of Tehran, how non-state actors backed by revolutionary leadership had forced the United States into paralysis, reinforced for negotiators and commanders that asymmetry was a battlefield in itself. By the mid-1980s, counterterrorism was no longer a niche concern. It became a central pillar of defense planning, directly traceable to the Iranian precedent. The ripple effects reached into geopolitics. The playbook tested in 1979 provided a model repeated elsewhere. When American and Western citizens were kidnapped in Lebanon in the mid-1980s, headlines immediately invoked comparisons. Officials recognized the pattern: hostages becoming tokens in larger political bargains, publicity leveraged for ideological advantage, governments forced to weigh concessions against credibility. Decades later, in conflicts from Afghanistan to Syria, and in places as disparate as Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea, the template has persisted. Seizing foreigners, whether journalists, aid workers, or dual nationals, remains a way to generate leverage in a cost-effective manner. Tehran's success in holding Americans at the center of world attention institutionalized this tactic. For authoritarian regimes, it became a kind of low-cost statecraft. Detain an outsider, amplify the spectacle, use the captive as leverage. Inside Iran, the hostage crisis reshaped national identity. The embassy seizure was recast domestically not as improvisation, but as a foundational moment of the Islamic Republic. Annual commemorations turned the incident into collective memory. School textbooks, political speeches, and state media reinforced the claim that defiance against the United States marked Iran's claim to sovereignty. This memory became self-sustaining. Every subsequent confrontation, from nuclear tensions to regional proxy wars, drew legitimacy from the narrative first crystallized in November 1979. The United States, by contrast, carried the episode as trauma. Officials feared a repeat scenario whenever crises broke abroad. In Washington, policymakers discussed Tehran as a standing reference point whenever citizens were endangered. The Department of Defense and State Department built procedures assuming embassies could be targeted again. Declassified interagency memos from the 1980s show that nearly every discussion of potential evacuations, from Central America to Africa, invoked the lesson of Tehran. Never assume mob action cannot escalate. Never delay preparations for withdrawal. The rift between Washington and Tehran, meanwhile, hardened into default hostility. Before 1979, tension was real, but dialogue remained possible. After the hostage crisis, mistrust became structural. Whether during the Iran-Iraq War, nuclear negotiations in Europe, or debates in the UN Security Council, American policymakers cautioned that Tehran's commitments could not be trusted. The origin of that suspicion lay directly in the memories of 1979, 1981, when formal assurances from Iran's government were overtaken by the revolutionary decision to hold Americans captive. The institutional legacy is stark. Militarily, the Holloway Report's exposure of failures led to the birth of USSOCOM and the Night Stalkers. Economically, the financial seizures of 1980 matured into permanent sanctions regimes, giving Washington a tool wielded against adversaries worldwide. Diplomatically, the crisis ushered in a new security architecture for embassies and normalized the concept that US citizens could be deliberate targets abroad. For Iran, it locked revolutionary defiance into national mythology. For the United States, it entrenched caution, suspicion, and a readiness to treat overseas capture as a political crisis capable of toppling leaders. The legacy is not measured only in scars or memories. It is measured in structures, doctrines, and practices that endured long after the last hostage left Tehran. The ordeal institutionalized a playbook of hostage diplomacy, one later governments on both sides would revisit, adapt, and refine. Out of the chaos of 1979-1981 emerged a set of templates: military reform forged by failure, sanctions systems transformed into policy, and a diplomatic security model designed for a more dangerous world. These legacies endured precisely because they solved the dilemmas exposed so brutally in Tehran. The release of the hostages kept lives intact, but the crisis itself left behind frameworks that redefined how states confront one another through people, money, and power. In the years that followed, leaders in Washington and adversaries abroad returned repeatedly to strategies first hardened in that crisis. Those strategies remain in circulation today, shaping how nations respond when citizens are detained abroad and how rivals exploit vulnerability. The institutional legacy of the hostages, captivity, is therefore not confined to history. It informs the present and directs the choices of policymakers still. And it set in motion a geopolitical struggle whose reverberations extend well beyond the walls of the captured embassy, guiding the confrontation that continues across the Middle East and beyond. The Iran hostage crisis stretched across 444 days and left behind more than the ordeal of captivity. It reshaped American policy for decades. From the Holloway Report that exposed Eagle Claw's failures and led to the creation of USSOCOM and the Night Stalkers, to economic sanctions that became standard tools of US statecraft, the episode institutionalized new approaches to power. It also offered a template for hostage diplomacy, where individuals became levers in global struggles. Looking back, which legacy surprises you most? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more deep dive documentaries.